Hello chums, and welcome to Taming a Monster, the series where I take some of Gran Turismo 7's most ridiculous cars to see if I can tweak them so that a talentless pleb like me can handle them without being killed to death. Like any common ruffian, I'm using a bog standard PlayStation 5 controller, and I have all driver assists turned off, except for ABS. Let's see what car is trying to murder me today. Today, we have a car that's been a very popular request for a while now. The Ford Focus RS gets the option for a supercharged V8 from the Ford GT Spec 2 test car, hence the livery. However, outside of the Suzuki Jimny, this is the least powerful four-wheel drive car tested so far. So, is it truly a monster? Well, let's find out. As usual, every upgrade has been applied, including the power upgrades, weight reduction, wide body, and body rigidity increase. However, none of the settings have yet been adjusted except for downforce, which is maxed, and the transmission, which has already been adjusted to suit this car's power. The standard wheels on the Focus RS are obscenely large, so I went with the smaller size for this build, partly because the car will ride the curbs better and partly because I think the bigger wheels look stupid. The Focus GT has a front splitter for front downforce and a rear wing for rear downforce. Both rear wing options provide the same level of downforce, so it doesn't matter which you choose. If you're interested in learning more about aero, downforce, or any other aspect of tuning your car, I have a series called Tuning for Beginners which covers everything from suspension to differential to the transmission. For the test track today, I chose Laguna Seca. The Focus got a predictably aggressive launch thanks to its four-wheel drive system. Similar to the Impreza in the previous episode, this car does not display any particularly worrying handling characteristics even with its default settings. That said, its brakes don't quite feel up to the task of stopping this car now that it has almost 200 horsepower over the standard engine. They're not terrible by any stretch, but they could certainly be better. Naturally, the car leans a lot, as all cars do on their default settings, to the point that accelerating out of mid-speed corners results in some very odd hopping tendencies. For my first adjustments, I tweaked the ride height slightly to make the car sit more visually even. This will make next to no difference to the way the car drives, but it will satisfy my OCD. As usual, I then increased the anti-roll bar stiffness and the natural frequency, which will reduce body roll and should hopefully make the car feel more predictable. On a tight track like Laguna Seca, this car is extremely fast. Its overall statistics would suggest it might be lacking when compared to the usual 1000 horsepower monsters that I feature. The flatter body control did make the car feel much more pleasurable to drive, though this is usually the case with cars on racing tyres. Surprisingly, the Focus is slightly prone to power oversteer, not in the same way as rear-wheel drive, but it is there. How is that bastard thing going so quickly? For my next tweaks, I adjusted the differential. I set initial torque lower at the rear. This can help with oversteer under braking that four-wheel drive cars are so common for. I increased acceleration sensitivity all around, which sends more power to the outside wheels, thus making the car less prone to understeer when accelerating out of corners. I reduced braking sensitivity because it usually makes the brakes feel sharper. I also adjusted the torque vectoring to send a tiny bit more power to the front wheels. This should improve overall traction out of the corners. That slight tendency towards power oversteer had now been replaced with a feeling as if the car was completely on rails. The traction difference, particularly out of the first hairpin corner, was very noticeable. If timed correctly, this car is capable of some truly savage corner exit speeds. The fact that it has only 800 horsepower or so means it doesn't quite have enough power to truly break traction in the same way as the 1000 horsepower monsters like the Porsche swapped Impreza and the GTR swapped Delta do. As a result, this feels like one of the smoothest cars I've ever tested. It's got a perfect mix of four-wheel drive traction, not too much power, and smooth, supercharged power delivery. It does, however, suffer with a tiny bit of power understeer in some cases. For my final changes, I increased compression, which usually helps the car deal with the curbs. I then decreased negative camber, which improves straight-line traction, and hopefully braking distances as a result. I also added a tiny bit of front toe in to reduce understeer when coasting through a corner, and I added some rear toe out which would help the car pull itself out of corners even more effectively. Rather unexpectedly, those changes made the Focus insanely darty and now had some fairly crazy turn-in abilities. The rear toe angle adjustments had reintroduced some of the power oversteer in low-speed corners. The car was almost certainly faster, though potentially less stable. I'm not particularly sure which I prefer. Either way, I shall decide the answer to that in the Nurburgring lap. Before I took on the Nordschleifer, I reeled back the toe angle adjustments in the hope of making the car slightly more smooth once again. This is one of those cars where your setup really depends on your driving style. For example, I typically prefer understeer to oversteer, so I set up the majority of my cars for overall stability and smoothness. This is why I set the torque vectoring to almost 50-50 in any four-wheel drive car that has its engine in the front. This gives the car maximum traction out of corners, which would normally induce understeer, so I cancel it out using rear toe out and high acceleration sensitivity values. This typically results in a four-wheel drive car that feels like it can't break traction, but also doesn't understeer wide on corner exit as much as you might expect. Someone who prefers oversteer could just send more power to the rear wheels using the torque vectoring, but I'm personally not much of a fan of doing that because it can somewhat cancel out the traction advantage of having four-wheel drive in the first place. As for the car itself, I admittedly wanted to dislike it. The only reason for that is personal taste. I've never liked Ford, especially modern Fords. I actually worked for a Ford dealership back in 2017 when these RSs were still blowing their head gaskets after 30,000 miles. To be fair though, most of my hatred is directed at the Ford Cougar, which American viewers will know as the Ford Escape. I worked as a detailer, if you can call a quick wash, vacuum and spray polish detailing, and the Mark II Cougar was utterly disposable. Anyway, you're not here for my employment history. I wanted to hate this car, and it's bloody excellent. Genuinely, this is easily one of the best engine swaps in all of Gran Turismo 7 by far. With under 800 horsepower and some fairly low downforce figures, this car's statistics would have you believe that it would be a solid midfielder, and that could not be further from the truth. This car is so utterly easy to use. It's smooth, predictable, it's very capable on any track. It handles high-speed corners much better than its low downforce values would suggest, and its power delivery is perfect because it's supercharged. There's no turbo lag and no giant dump of torque firing you into a wall. The power comes on predictably and smoothly, and even better still, this car has a Group 3 engine giving it excellent fuel economy, so it's a very good contender for any races with fuel consumption turned on. I cannot recommend this car enough. Lancia Delta is still more fun though. In the end, the Ford Focus Spec 2 managed a 6 minutes 19, putting it ahead of a lot of cars you might not expect, from the 1200 horsepower Demon Charger to the R35 swapped Alpine A110. The E30 M3 only just beats it thanks to its rear diffuser and extra downforce. So, that was my attempt to tame a monster. I hope my settings helped, or that you enjoyed this video. Join me next time where I'm driving something that's probably not four-wheel drive. Thank you very much for watching, and if you're feeling particularly generous, I would greatly appreciate your subscription. Take care now, and ta-ra!